Hello everyone, and welcome back to Dark Evidence, where we explore the mysteries that change the world, stories that are not just crimes, but lessons in trust, fear, and the human psyche. Today we return to one of the most haunting unsolved cases in American history. It is a story that began on a calm September morning in 1982 in the city of Chicago. A story that would shake the entire nation's sense of safety and forever change the way medicine is made, sold, and trusted. At first, it seemed like an ordinary day. People were going to work, parents were packing lunches, and stores were stocked with familiar red and white bottles of a painkiller everyone trusted, Tylenol. It was a household name, the go-to remedy for headaches and fevers, something so ordinary that no one would ever think twice before taking it. But that ordinary trust would soon turn into a national nightmare. Within just a few hours, 7 people, including a 12-year-old girl and a young couple, suddenly collapsed and died after taking capsules of extra-strength Tylenol. The cause was invisible, silent, and deadly: potassium cyanide, a poison that kills within minutes. Investigators would soon realize that someone had tampered with random bottles, replacing the medicine inside with a lethal chemical and returning them to store shelves. What followed was pure chaos. Supermarkets cleared their aisles. Pharmacies pulled thousands of bottles off their shelves. People across America began checking every capsule, every bottle, every seal, terrified that something as simple as pain relief could now mean death. And then came the chilling realization this was not an accident. It was a deliberate act, carried out by an unknown hand. There was no warning, no message, no reason that made sense. The FBI launched one of the largest criminal investigations in U.S. history, yet decades later, the person behind it all remains unidentified. The Tylenol poisonings were not just about 7 tragic deaths. They became a symbol of how fragile public trust can be, and how quickly fear can spread when the ordinary turns deadly. In the aftermath, the U.S. government and pharmaceutical companies introduced new safety standards: tamper-evident seals, protective packaging, and strict product recalls, things we take for granted today, but were born out of this tragedy. Over 40 years later, the case still haunts investigators and historians alike. Despite thousands of leads, interviews, and re-examinations, no one has ever been charged for the murders. The prime suspect, James W. Lewis, died in 2023, still claiming he was innocent. So tonight we revisit the question that has lingered for decades: who poisoned America's medicine cabinet and why? Because some stories never rest. Some crimes echo across generations. And the Tylenol murders remain one of those stories that remind us that sometimes the most terrifying monsters are not strangers in the dark, but the dangers hiding in plain sight. It all began on the morning of September 29, 1982, when 12-year-old Mary Kellerman of Elk Grove Village, Illinois, woke up feeling a little under the weather. Like any parent would, her father handed her a capsule of extra-strength Tylenol, a brand millions trusted without hesitation. Within minutes, Mary collapsed in the bathroom. She was rushed to the hospital, but it was too late. Doctors were puzzled. There were no visible injuries, no warning signs. It was as if life had been suddenly extinguished. Later that same day, another tragedy unfolded. Adam Janis, a 27-year-old postal worker from Arlington Heights, also took Tylenol for a headache. He too suddenly fell unconscious and died at the hospital. Doctors suspected a heart attack until the unthinkable happened. That very evening, 2 more members of the Janis family, Stanley and Teresa, took Tylenol from the same bottle while grieving Adam's death. Within hours, both of them were dead. By nightfall, Illinois hospitals were overwhelmed with fear and confusion. What was happening? How could perfectly healthy people die after taking something so common and trusted? At first, doctors thought it was an isolated contamination, perhaps a bad batch or a chemical reaction. But as more cases emerged across the Chicago area, the horrifying pattern became undeniable. In Lombard, Illinois, Mary Reiner, a young mother recovering from childbirth, also collapsed after taking Tylenol. In Winfield, Paula Prince, a flight attendant for United Airlines, was found dead in her apartment, a half-empty Tylenol bottle on her bathroom counter. In each case, the victims had taken the same brand, the same type of capsule, and the same result followed: sudden, fatal collapse. When forensic experts analyzed the capsules, the truth hit like a thunderbolt. The Tylenol had been laced with potassium cyanide, one of the most lethal poisons known to man. Just a few milligrams can stop the body from absorbing oxygen, causing death in minutes. Investigators soon pieced together the grim picture. Someone had opened random bottles of Tylenol, replaced some of the medicine with cyanide, and put them back on store shelves. It was an act so cold, so calculated, that it defied logic. There was no ransom demand, no clear motive, only chaos and terror. Johnson & Johnson, the company behind Tylenol, quickly launched an emergency recall, pulling more than 31 million bottles off the market at a cost of over $100 million. It was the first nationwide recall of its kind, and it changed the way the world thought about consumer safety. For the families of the victims, however, no corporate apology or safety reform could bring their loved ones back. The people who died that day were not celebrities or politicians. They were ordinary Americans, simply trying to get through their day. And that is what made it so terrifying. It could have been anyone. The Tylenol murders did not just take lives. They shattered the illusion of safety inside every home in America. As investigators searched desperately for answers, the nation was gripped by fear. Grocery stores emptied their shelves. Parents checked every medicine cabinet, and pharmacies refused to sell Tylenol altogether. The FBI was flooded with thousands of tips, some helpful, most based on panic. But then a chilling letter arrived that shifted the direction of the entire case. The letter was addressed to Johnson & Johnson, the manufacturer of Tylenol. It read, in essence, "If you want the killing to stop, wire me $1 million. It was signed by a man named James W. Lewis. Lewis quickly became the prime suspect. He lived in Cambridge, Massachusetts, far from Chicago, but his letter made specific claims that caught the attention of investigators. He seemed to know details that were not yet public. In his message, he demanded the money be sent to a bank account belonging to a former employer, someone with whom he had a bitter feud. To authorities, this looked like more than coincidence. It looked like revenge disguised as extortion. The FBI arrested Lewis in New York City shortly after tracing the letter. When they searched his home, they found manuals on poisons, chemistry notes, and typewriter ribbons that matched the letter he sent. It seemed like the case was cracked. The faceless killer had a name. But as interrogations continued, the story began to unravel. There was no direct evidence linking Lewis to the cyanide-laced Tylenol bottles. He had never been to Chicago during the time of the killings, and no fingerprints, DNA, or witnesses placed him near any of the stores involved. His wife even claimed he was being framed. Federal prosecutors eventually realized they could not prove murder. Instead, Lewis was convicted of extortion for the threatening letter and sentenced to 20 years in prison. He served about 13 years before being released in the mid-1990s. Despite his conviction, Lewis continued to live under a dark cloud of suspicion for decades. In interviews, he often portrayed himself as a scapegoat, someone who had made a stupid mistake, but was not the killer. Still, his behavior remained strange. In one TV appearance, he spoke about how someone could have done it in chillingly precise detail, describing the tampering process almost like a tutorial. For investigators and the public alike, Lewis became the face of the Tylenol tragedy, not because they were sure he was guilty, but because he was the only one who seemed close enough to understand how it could have been done. And yet, when he died in 2023, at age 76, he took with him the answers that millions had waited over 40 years to hear. Was he truly innocent, or did the killer die without ever being caught? The mystery only deepened after his death, because just before he passed away, James W. Lewis gave one final interview, on camera one that would send chills down the spines of everyone who watched it. After James W. Lewis was arrested, the FB, I hoped that his confession, or even a mistake, would finally bring closure to one of America's darkest mysteries. But instead, his capture only deepened the uncertainty. The more investigators dug, the less sense it all made. Even while Lewis sat in custody, bottles of Tylenol were still being tested across the country, and the results painted a terrifying picture. The contamination was not isolated to a single store or shipment. Instead, the poisoned bottles came from different lots, different factories, and different retail chains, meaning the tampering likely happened after the medicine left Johnson & Johnson's control. Someone had manually placed the deadly capsules back onto store shelves in the Chicago area. This realization was both horrifying and baffling. How could anyone move through so many stores without being noticed? And why would they do it? The motives were unclear. There was no political message, no personal vendetta, no pattern in the victims. It was an act of terror before that term became common. A random strike at the trust people had in everyday life. The FBI launched one of the largest investigations in U.S. history at that time. More than 100 agents were assigned to the case. They followed over 30,000 leads, interviewed witnesses across multiple states, and even examined chemical supply records to trace every possible source of cyanide. But each promising lead seemed to collapse into dead ends. Meanwhile, the country was in chaos. Hospitals set up emergency hotlines. Pharmacists worked overnight to check packaging for signs of tampering. And Johnson & Johnson made a decision that would later be called one of the boldest crisis responses in corporate history. They recalled 31 million bottles of Tylenol nationwide, worth more than $100 million. The move, while costly, helped restore public confidence and became a global model for how to handle a consumer tragedy. As for James Lewis, the so-called man behind the letter, he became both a focus and a distraction. He was convicted for extortion, not murder, but remained in the public eye. Investigators admitted that while he fit the psychological profile of someone capable of manipulation and planning, there was no forensic link tying him to the crime scenes. It was as if the real killer had simply vanished into thin air. Years passed. Leads grew cold. Agents retired. But the question remained, was Lewis truly just an opportunist? Or had he found a way to commit the perfect crime and get away with it? By the late 1980s, the FBI's Tylenol Task Force had scaled back operations. Still, the case continued to haunt detectives, and every now and then, new tips emerged, old evidence resurfaced, and hopes of finding the truth flickered back to life. What no one knew then was that, decades later, the story would return not because of a new suspect, but because technology itself had changed. In July of 2023, more than 40 years after the Tylenol murders, news broke that James W. Lewis, the man who had long been shadowed by suspicion, had died at his home in Cambridge, Massachusetts. He was 76 years old. For many, his death reopened a wound that had never really healed. Investigators who had worked the case decades earlier described it as the closing of a long and frustrating chapter, yet one that still had no ending. Lewis died without ever being charged for the murders. And he died, still insisting he was innocent. What made his final months so unsettling was that shortly before his death, Lewis sat down for a rare on-camera interview for a documentary series titled Cold Case, The Tylenol Murders. In that interview, filmed in early 2023, he once again denied any involvement in the killings. But as he spoke, many viewers noticed something eerie: his calm tone, his precise understanding of the poison, and his unsettling ability to describe how someone could have pulled off the crime. It was not a confession, but it sounded disturbingly close. After his passing, detectives and journalists began revisiting the case with renewed intensity. With Lewis gone, there was both freedom and frustration. Freedom to explore theories without fear of defamation, but frustration because the one man who might have known the truth could no longer speak. That same year, the Chicago Police Department quietly began reviewing the evidence again. Modern forensic science, especially DNA testing and digital chemical analysis, had advanced far beyond what was possible in the early 1980s. Investigators hoped that something, perhaps a trace of DNA on a capsule, a fingerprint on a box, or residue from a bottle seal, might finally offer a lead. So far, no major breakthrough has been announced. But behind the scenes, specialists in cold case forensics continue to test and retest what remains of the evidence. Even the FBI's archived case files were revisited, using artificial intelligence tools to detect linguistic patterns in the anonymous letters and compare them with known samples from Lewis and other suspects. At the same time, media interest surged. The Netflix series brought the case back into the public conversation. Viewers who had not even been born in 1982 found themselves fascinated by this haunting story, not just because of its mystery, but because it felt timeless. It was about trust, fear, and how one person's actions could change an entire nation's habits. The release of the documentary also led to new witnesses stepping forward, retired store employees, former investigators, and even people who had lived near the retail locations involved. Some shared memories long forgotten. Others revealed strange coincidences that had never been fully explored. 4 decades after the first capsule was poisoned, the Tylenol murders remain unsolved. But the death of James W. Lewis reignited one truth. The story is not over. Because somewhere in the shadows of history, in a case file, a forgotten bottle, or a single strand of DNA, the answer might still be waiting. 40 years ago, when the Tylenol murders first gripped the nation, DNA testing did not exist as a practical tool for investigators. Forensic science was limited to fingerprints, handwriting, and chemical residue. But in today's world, where a single hair or trace of saliva can reveal an identity, the case has taken on new life. In recent years, the Chicago Police Department, working alongside FBI forensic consultants, has quietly reopened several pieces of the original evidence. The hope is simple yet profound, that modern technology might find what the human eye once missed. The process began with a full inventory of every surviving piece of physical evidence: bottles, boxes, capsules, even old lab reports. Many of these items had been locked away in climate-controlled storage since the early 1980s. Scientists carefully examined them using next-generation DNA sequencing, scanning for microscopic biological traces that older methods could never have detected. Even a skin cell left behind by whoever handled the poisoned capsules could be enough to identify a suspect today. At the same time, experts in chemical forensics began reanalyzing the cyanide itself. By comparing its chemical signature, the ratio of impurities and additives, scientists could trace where the compound might have been produced or purchased. This form of chemical fingerprinting can sometimes narrow down suppliers, potentially linking the poison to a specific region or industrial source. Investigators also turned to digital forensics, not to examine computers from the 1980s, but to apply artificial intelligence and linguistic analysis to archived documents. They have been comparing the extortion letter sent by James W. Lewis to thousands of handwritten samples collected during the original investigation, searching for subtle word patterns and syntax unique to a single author. This AI-assisted approach, though new, has already been used successfully in other cold cases. Still, the work is painstakingly slow. Much of the evidence has degraded over time, and the contaminated capsules were handled by dozens of people during testing and recall efforts, complicating the DNA picture. Yet, even with these obstacles, investigators remain cautiously optimistic. The technology that solved the Golden State Killer case decades later could, in theory, do the same here. Meanwhile, the Tylenol case continues to attract volunteer experts, retired detectives, private DNA analysts, and students of forensic history. For many of them, it is not just about finding the killer. It is about closing one of the most haunting chapters in American public life. A chapter that still affects how every consumer product is sealed and trusted today. The idea that a single strand of DNA could unlock a 40-year-old mystery gives this cold case a pulse once more. The question is whether time has preserved enough of the truth to be found. Because in this story, science is not just a tool. It is the last hope for justice. By the time modern investigators returned to the Tylenol case, much of the original evidence was buried under 40 years of reports, interviews, and forgotten leads. Yet within those thousands of pages, detectives believed there were still clues, small inconsistencies, overlooked testimonies, and details that had slipped through the cracks in the chaos of 1982. The renewed investigation began not just in the lab, but in the archives. Teams of analysts spent months scanning and digitizing every surviving police report, FBI memo, and corporate document. Old photographs were enhanced using AI-assisted imaging to reveal what the original film could not. Handwritten witness notes were transcribed, cross-referenced, and compared for contradictions. Bit by bit, the investigators began reconstructing the human side of the case, the people who might have seen something that did not make sense back then. One of the first areas re-examined was the timeline of the poisonings. In 1982, authorities had assumed all the deadly bottles came from a single batch. But new analysis suggested that the capsules might have been tampered with at multiple stores across the Chicago area, possibly by someone moving through neighborhoods, carefully selecting which bottles to target. Detectives started tracing store inventories, cash register logs, and even delivery truck routes, searching for any pattern that might reveal where the killer had gone. They also revisited the store employees and pharmacists who had worked during those days. Many were now elderly, but a surprising number remembered vivid details: a man lingering near the pain relief aisle, a woman returning a box without explanation, or a stranger who seemed unusually interested in product packaging. None of these recollections alone proved anything, but together they began to form a shadowy picture of possibility. Investigators also reviewed people who had once been considered persons of interest but later dismissed. Some had criminal backgrounds involving chemical knowledge. Others had access to cyanide through work. A few had even lived near the stores where the poisoned bottles were sold. At the time, those connections seemed weak, but through the lens of modern profiling and the data-driven methods of 2020's crime analysis, they looked a lot more intriguing. Parallel to this, Johnson & Johnson's internal documents were revisited. They showed how chaotic the recall had been. Thousands of bottles rushed back from across the nation. Among them were several still sealed, never opened, and never tested. Some of those bottles were located in storage decades later, now invaluable for forensic re-examination. It is this combination of memory and modern technology that keeps the Tylenol case alive today. Every interview, every dusty file, every photo, all of it is being given a second look. Because sometimes, the truth is not hidden. It is just buried under years of noise, waiting for someone to see what everyone else missed. 4 decades after the Tylenol murders, something unexpected happened. The story came back to life, not through new evidence, but through the power of storytelling itself. When the documentary Cold Case, The Tylenol Murders premiered, it reignited public curiosity on a massive scale. Streaming on Netflix and other major platforms, the series was not just a retelling. It was an investigation reborn. Using modern cinematography, digital archives, and interviews with surviving detectives, it turned an old tragedy into a modern mystery that felt as urgent as ever. Viewers across the world, many too young to remember the 1980s, were stunned to learn how fragile consumer trust had once been. The series painted vivid portraits of the victims, the investigators, and the chaos that gripped Chicago. It also reintroduced James W. Lewis, allowing him to speak one last time before his death in 2023. His calm demeanor and unsettling precision reignited the debate. Was he an innocent man caught in the storm? Or was he quietly confessing through indifference? As the show gained traction, podcasts, YouTube channels, and online forums joined in. True crime communities began dissecting every frame, every quote, and every timeline. Reddit threads and investigative YouTube documentaries analyzed photos of the bottles, compared chemical reports, and questioned why some leads had been dropped decades ago. It was the digital age taking on a Cold War-era mystery, and for the first time in years, new voices were adding new energy to an old case. More importantly, this wave of attention brought new information. Several retired law enforcement officers stepped forward to share unpublished notes and forgotten insights. A few former Johnson & Johnson employees revealed internal chaos during the recall moments when evidence may have been misplaced or overlooked in the rush to protect the brand. And some Chicago residents who had lived near the affected stores began recalling small but curious details: unusual visitors, discarded bottles, or people acting nervous in pharmacy aisles around that time. While none of these revelations provided the smoking gun, they breathed new life into the investigation. Detectives working the cold case began receiving new tips, some vague, others oddly specific. Even after decades, the idea that someone, somewhere, might still know the truth felt suddenly real again. The case also drew the attention of academic researchers studying consumer psychology and public fear. How could one event change how millions of people viewed something as simple as medicine? How did fear spread faster than facts? The Tylenol murders became not just a criminal case, but a cultural study, a story about how trust can vanish overnight. And in that renewed attention, one thing became clear. This story would not fade quietly. It continues to echo across generations in classrooms, in documentaries, and in the collective memory of a nation that once realized that safety, even in the most ordinary places, can never be taken for granted. When James W. Lewis agreed to speak for the cameras one last time, it was not just another interview. It was an eerie window into the mind of a man who had spent 4 decades living in the shadow of suspicion. The footage, filmed only months before his death in 2023, would become one of the most unsettling moments in true crime television. In that interview, Lewis appeared calm, articulate, and oddly confident. Sitting in his modest Massachusetts apartment, he spoke about the 1982 Tylenol murders, as though discussing a case study rather than a personal accusation. He denied any involvement, insisting that the extortion letter he wrote to Johnson & Johnson was nothing more than a desperate attempt to draw attention to himself, a stupid mistake, as he called it. But what disturbed many viewers and the investigators who watched the footage later was the precision with which he described the crime. Lewis explained in almost clinical detail how someone could have opened a capsule, replaced the powder with cyanide, and resealed the bottle without anyone noticing. His explanation was so technically sound that even forensic experts admitted it matched how the tampering must have been done. He was not confessing, at least, not directly, but his tone, his detached phrasing, and his fascination with the method rather than the morality raised questions that no one could ignore. One retired FBI agent described it perfectly. He did not sound like a man accused of murder. He sounded like a man remembering a project. Psychological profilers who studied Lewis's interviews, writings, and courtroom behavior described him as a high-functioning narcissist, intelligent, meticulous, and drawn to control through intellect. He reportedly enjoyed the attention the case brought him, granting interviews and writing letters to journalists over the years. Some experts suggested that even if he had not committed the murders, he might have been psychologically compelled to insert himself into the narrative to become part of something larger than himself. And yet others were not so sure. Lewis had a history of deception, forgery, and fraud, including a conviction for mail fraud years before the Tylenol crisis. His knowledge of chemistry, his ability to manipulate public perception, and his timing all kept him in the crosshairs of investigators until the day he died. Even in death, Lewis remains a paradox. To some, he was a manipulative criminal who thrived on attention but lacked the means to commit the murders. To others, he was the perfect kind of killer, one who hid behind intelligence, distance, and time. In the end, the interview did not close the case. It opened new layers of mystery, because if Lewis was innocent, how did he know so much? And if he was guilty, how did he manage to keep that secret for over 40 years and take it with him to the grave? The camera stopped rolling. The man smiled. And with that, one of America's most haunting cold cases grew even colder. While James W. Lewis remained the public face of the Tylenol murders, he was not the only person investigators ever considered. In fact, the FBI's Tylenol Task Force explored dozens of alternative leads, each more bizarre, more complex, and more frustrating than the last. Over time, the investigation spread beyond Chicago, reaching into the world of chemistry, organized crime, and even domestic terrorism. One of the earliest theories focused on a disgruntled employee or someone connected to the pharmaceutical supply chain. Could a worker inside Johnson & Johnson or its packaging division have tampered with the capsules before they reached the stores? Forensic analysis quickly dismissed that idea. The poisoned bottles came from multiple factories and appeared in stores far apart from one another. This was not an inside job. It was someone operating in the open, buying the bottles, poisoning them, and quietly placing them back on shelves. Then came the copycat theories. After the 1982 murders, several people attempted to replicate the crime, spiking other consumer goods like mouthwash and candy. Some were arrested, others were mentally unstable individuals seeking attention, but none matched the precision or planning of the original Chicago attacks. The killer, whoever they were, seemed methodical and deliberate, and likely had knowledge of both chemistry and human behavior. In the late 1990s, the curious theory surfaced, linking the Tylenol murders to Ted Kaczynski, better known as the Unabomber. At first glance, the idea seemed far-fetched. Kaczynski's crimes involved bombs, not poison. But both cases shared strange similarities: random victims, calculated fear, and a fascination with technological control. FBI profilers briefly explored the possibility that Kaczynski might have been inspired by the Tylenol panic, or even involved before his bombing spree began. However, no hard evidence ever supported that link. Other investigators looked at industrial chemists, pharmacists, or ex-employees of chemical companies who had access to cyanide. A few names surfaced, including individuals who lived near the Chicago suburbs at the time, but every promising suspect eventually hit a dead end. Either alibis checked out, or forensic evidence failed to connect them to the contaminated bottles. Another persistent theory was that the act was motiveless terrorism, not tied to money or revenge, but a desire to create fear on a national scale. If that was true, the killer succeeded beyond imagination. Within days of the first deaths, Americans across the country began distrusting not only Tylenol, but every over-the-counter product in their homes. The fear was so intense that even candy and baby food sales plummeted. Decades later, none of these theories could be fully proven or entirely dismissed. The Tylenol murders became a psychological puzzle rather than a solvable crime, with each new theory exposing how fragile public trust can be. As one retired agent put it, this was not just about poison in a bottle. It was about someone who understood how fear works and used it perfectly. Even though the Tylenol murders remain unsolved, their impact reshaped the modern world in ways few crimes ever have. What began as an unthinkable tragedy in a handful of Chicago neighborhoods soon transformed into a turning point for global consumer safety. The lessons learned from those 7 deaths changed not only how medicines are packaged, but how companies respond to crisis and how the public defines trust. In the early 1980s, medicine packaging was simple and accessible. Most over-the-counter drugs came in gelatin capsules, easy to open, easy to swallow, and, as the tragedy revealed, easy to tamper with. There were no safety seals, no plastic wraps, no protective barriers. Consumers trusted that what they bought from the shelf was safe because it had always been safe. The Tylenol case shattered that illusion in a single week. After the murders, Johnson & Johnson made an unprecedented decision. They pulled 31 million bottles of Tylenol off shelves nationwide, even though only a few were found to be poisoned. It was a costly move, over $100 million lost, but it also became a case study in corporate ethics. Instead of denying responsibility, the company prioritized public safety, communicated openly with the media, and worked with the FDA to rebuild consumer confidence. That decision paid off. Within a year, Tylenol had regained most of its market share, a recovery that experts still describe as a miracle of trust. The company's response became the gold standard for crisis management taught in business schools around the world. But the more profound legacy came from the changes it inspired in manufacturing and law. The U.S. government swiftly introduced new regulations requiring tamper-evident packaging seals, shrink wraps, and glued boxes that make it obvious if a product has been opened. Within months, every major pharmaceutical company followed suit. Even items like food, cosmetics, and household cleaners adopted similar safety features. In many ways, we all live differently today because of that 1 week in 1982. Every time you twist a childproof cap, hear the crack of a safety seal, or peel away a layer of plastic before opening medicine, you are seeing the legacy of those 7 victims. The Tylenol murders also changed how law enforcement and corporations communicate during emergencies. The coordinated efforts between the FBI, media, and private industries set a precedent for how future crises, from product recalls to contamination scares, would be handled. Transparency became as vital as technology, and beyond policy and packaging, the case changed something deeper: the psychology of trust. It made people look twice at the things they once took for granted. It reminded society that danger does not always come from the dark alley or the stranger sometimes. It sits quietly on a pharmacy shelf. The Tylenol tragedy left scars that time could not erase, but it also left behind a system designed to make sure it never happens again. More than 40 years have passed since the Tylenol murders, and yet the case still sits open, a cold file that refuses to close. Investigators, journalists, and families of the victims have all hoped for that one missing piece of truth that could finally bring peace. But despite decades of re-examinations, evolving technology, and shifting theories, the question remains the same: who poisoned America's most trusted medicine, and why? Today, the case is officially still active, but it is a shadow of its former investigation. The FBI task force that once had over 100 agents has long been disbanded. Now, a small team within the Chicago Police Department occasionally reviews the evidence, especially as new forensic tools emerge. The physical evidence, the surviving bottles, capsules, and packaging, has been preserved under strict conditions. Each item is a time capsule from 1982, still holding the potential for answers if technology can reach far enough. The death of James W. Lewis in 2023 closed one door but reopened many questions. Without him, there is no longer a living suspect connected to the case by name, yet his death reignited both public and investigative interest. For some, Lewis's passing confirmed that justice may never be served. For others, it became motivation, a reason to keep digging, hoping that science might finally do what humans could not. Meanwhile, DNA technology continues to advance. Cold case units across the U.S. have solved decades-old murders using genealogical databases and trace evidence once considered unusable. Experts believe that the same methods could, one day, identify the person who handled the cyanide-laced capsules if even a single microscopic trace remains intact. It is a faint hope, but one that refuses to die. Culturally, the Tylenol murders have transcended the category of crime. They have become a cautionary tale, a moment in history when an invisible act of evil changed how an entire nation viewed safety. From classrooms to boardrooms, the story is studied as an example of crisis, ethics, and fear. And every anniversary brings new documentaries, podcasts, and articles revisiting the same haunting question. How could someone commit such an act and simply vanish? The victims' families, now older, still speak publicly from time to time. Their message is always the same. It is not about revenge. It is about closure. They want a name, a face, and a reason, something to replace the silence that has lingered for over 4 decades. In the end, the Tylenol murders are more than an unsolved case. They are a mirror of humanity's deepest vulnerability. They remind us that trust is fragile, and that evil does not always announce itself. Sometimes it hides in plain sight, disguised as something familiar, something safe. And so, as investigators continue their quiet work, the mystery endures, suspended between science and fate, between truth and fear. The case may be cold, but the question it left behind still burns. Who did it, and will we ever know? As we reach the end of this haunting journey, one truth stands. Above all, the Tylenol murders changed the world, but not in the way anyone expected. What began as an invisible act of cruelty in 1982 became a turning point for safety, science, and human awareness. It exposed how fragile trust can be, how quickly fear can spread, and how even in moments of chaos, compassion and responsibility can prevail. Johnson & Johnson's recall of 31 million bottles was more than a corporate move. It was an act of accountability that saved lives and set new global standards. The tragedy forced lawmakers to reshape packaging laws, inspired new forensic disciplines, and taught the world that transparency can restore faith even after disaster. But for the families who lost loved ones, those reforms could never erase the pain. Their grief became the quiet heartbeat of this story. A reminder that behind every headline are real people, real homes, and moments that can never be undone. 40 years later, the killer remains nameless, faceless, a ghost in history. Maybe science will one day uncover the truth. Maybe a hidden document or long-forgotten memory will finally give the story the ending it deserves. Or perhaps, like so many mysteries, the answer will remain forever out of reach, buried beneath time, pride, and silence. But what endures is not just fear. It is the resilience of those who refused to give up, investigators who kept returning to old files, journalists who kept the story alive, and families who continued to speak their loved ones' names. The Tylenol case reminds us that even in the darkest chapters, humanity's instinct to seek truth never fades. And maybe that is the real legacy of this case, not the poison, not the fear, but the pursuit of justice, no matter how long it takes. Thank you, everyone, for staying with us through this chilling yet vital story. If you found this episode compelling, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe, not just for the mystery, but for the memory of those whose lives were lost. Because every story we tell here is not just about crime. It is about people, choices, and the fragile thread that connects us all. Until next time, stay curious, stay cautious, and never stop asking questions. This is Dark Evidence, signing off where the truth never dies. Even when the case grows cold,